Welcome everybody here. This is a presentation sponsored by Saskatoon Metro's Education and Policy Committee, and the thanks should go to Karen Kololenko, who's been the chairperson of that action group. And I haven't counted the number of sessions that have been organized by the committee, but this must be about number 20 since 2020. So I think we've done a very good job. I think people have really appreciated it. And we really appreciate support of people coming from all over the province, particularly tonight.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I'll probably ask you to say goodnight to everybody a little bit later. But I just want to point out to everybody that while our politician friends are focused on the problems of today, the Saskatoon Metro NDP knows that if we form government in 2024, there'll be a scant 6 years for Saskatchewan to meet its climate action obligations for 2030. Not to mention contributing to Canada's goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. And if you remember, our old friend Peter Preble says it's going to take us about 30 years. So we're a little behind already. Anyway, Saskatoon Metro is giving a lot of thought today about dealing with our real problems. The first and foremost of which is the climate emergency. Consequently, we've invited the province's most lucid thinkers on the subject to give us some concrete alternatives to deal with the climate challenge. By the way, there's a spoiler alert here. It has to do with electrification. So who are they? There's Dr. Emily Eaton, is a professor at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Regina. In Treaty 4, she's a white settler doing research and teaching service devoted to addressing the climate and inequality crisis at local and national scales, and mapping pathways to transition that rectify the unjust colonial relationship that Canada has with its Indigenous people and marginalized communities. With her is Simon Enoch, who is the director of Saskatchewan office for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I've got to give a big plug to the CCPA. It's a really valuable resource. And if you're not on their mailing list, go to their site and sign up because it's just great. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Regina. So take it away, both of you.
All right, well, thanks so much for the invitation to join you tonight. We've been told that we have about 45 minutes and that should leave lots of time for questions. So we wanted to walk you through a little bit what we see as, Saskatchewan's, the needed contributions of Saskatchewan towards Canada's climate change targets and commitments. So Simon's going to start the slideshow and we're going to move forward or back and forth between both of us. Once you have the slides up, I'll start.
Okay, I will. I just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you so much, Karen, for inviting us, and thanks to Saskatoon Metro NDP for having us tonight. So I will share my screen. Please let me know if you can actually see it because we had difficulties before. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Wonderful.
I can. All right, so we wanted to start with some international context about what we need to do to rescue a habitable planet in the face of rising greenhouse gas emissions globally. So we'll start tonight with the 2018 IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which was released in 2018 called Global Warming of 1.5 Degrees. This report suggested that if we want to keep global warming to roughly 1.5 degrees or well under 2 degrees, what we need to do is by 2030, the globe needs to decrease our emissions by 45% below 2010 levels, and that we need to globally reach net zero by 2050. And this was really spurred by the 2015 Paris Agreement. So you've heard of the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We just came out of one, but the Paris Agreement in 2015 came out of one of those COPs where countries agreed to keep global warming well under 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees. This was something that was fought really hard by the so-called Global South countries, many of which will be more impacted by a heating world. So 2 degrees then is a critical threshold. So for example, with 1.5 degrees of global warming, we can expect about 1 sea ice-free Arctic summer per century, but this likelihood is increased to at least 1 per decade with 2 degrees of global warming. And so the report really outlines like what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 and shows why it's critical that globally we commit to getting closer to that 1.5 and staying well below 2. So there's a number of things. I won't tell you all the details tonight, but it is a critical threshold. And again, in order to stay below 2 degrees, closer to 1.5, it was decided through the international panel of experts that our targets are about globally 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So you can advance the slide. Simon is driving the slide deck. Can he advance the slide? Yes. So that IPCC report also said, you know, if we consider greenhouse gas emissions as sort of pollution that is filling up a bathtub, we can think about what is the global carbon budget that is left to us. In other words, it doesn't just matter how many greenhouse gas emissions we're producing every year, it matters how much cumulatively is in the bathtub. We have some levers where we can open the drain a little bit. We'll talk about that later maybe. But generally we have this carbon budget for all of the people in all of the countries in the world to stay below 2 degrees. And that was determined as if we want a 67% chance of staying below 2, we have about 230 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent left to emit globally. If we want a 50% chance, then that number can move up to about 440 gigatons. And that is starting in the year 2020. So cumulatively, again, everything we put into that bathtub is filling it up more and more. And so everything counts. What matters then is how much total greenhouse gas emissions are in our atmosphere. So we have a rate at which we're filling the tub up, and we can throttle the flow of the water. We can work hard to increase the drainage of the tub, but what matters is how much is in the tub. And so just to give you a sense of what is contributing to our flow of emissions into that tub, 86% of global emissions over the last decade have come from one industry. You could call them maybe many industries, but the fossil fuel industries. And 81% of primary energy demand, so what we consume, comes from fossil fuels. So when we look at this global carbon budget, then we're really understanding that what we need to do is address this problem of fossil fuel production and consumption. Canada's 2021 to 2050 oil and gas production, as projected by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, would exhaust about 16% of the world's, and they used the 67% chance, so that the world's 230 gigaton carbon budget, just by continuing to produce what Canada is planning to produce in terms of fossil fuels. So you can see here again, sort of Canada's outsized role in the flow of that water that's filling up the bathtub. So really for us, like anybody who's serious about mitigating climate change in Canada, is really focused again on the oil and gas industry, and if we can turn that tap down a little bit. Just to give you a sense, annual emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent from burning fossil fuels industrial processes, and land use change are estimated right now at about 42.2 gigatons per year. So you divide 230 by 42.2 and you don't get much. And so it's really imperative that we move up those timelines and start to, again, like throttle the flow of the water as soon as possible. Okay, we'll move forward there. I won't spend too much time on that. And so basically this is making the point again that there's no path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero without addressing again the energy industries or the fossil fuel industries, and therefore also without energy transition. This means replacing fossil fuels as sources of energy with non-emitting sources. It doesn't mean adding more renewables to the mix, right? We have to actually have a peak of fossil fuel production, and it has to decline as rapidly as possible. So if we look at global, again, greenhouse gas emissions, we can see here that the majority of the global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from energy. Whether that's energy that's used by industry, in transport, in buildings, we need to have an energy transition. Yes, agriculture, forestry, and land use are significant there. And we can talk maybe later about some of the things that we might do on that side. But the real thing that we need to do to rescue a habitable planet involves energy transition. You can advance. This was a report produced by the International Energy Agency in 2021, and their report was called Net Zero by 2050, and in it they mapped out a pathway to net zero, a net zero future. And what you can see in this slide is in 2021, they were already calling for no new oil and gas fields approved for development globally, no new coal mines or mine extensions. So the path to zero involves zero expansion, basically, of fossil fuel industries. It involves actually winding them down to zero. 2021 for the IEA's net zero plan was peak production, and fossil fuels had to decline really rapidly thereafter. We can make these slides available after the fact. There's some other interesting things that they've included in this pathway, but we'll move ahead because we want to get towards Saskatchewan here. So you've probably heard that Canada's emissions are so negligible that, you know, anything that we do here doesn't really matter unless China is usually the country that is mobilized, sometimes India, even though in fact the United States is the second largest greenhouse gas producer. But there are, right, several large producers of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And it is true that China needs to act, the United States needs to act, India needs to act, Russia needs to act, Japan, Germany, etc. But what I wanted to point out here, this is actually in absolute terms. So this doesn't even account for per capita emissions. This is just total absolute emissions from different countries around the world. And Canada actually ranks number 11. We produce the 11th most greenhouse gas emissions in the whole world. There are about 195 countries in the world. So if no country that produces fewer greenhouse or as many greenhouse gases emissions as we do acts, if only the top 10 act, we're never going to touch most of the emissions that we need to in order to get to net zero. Okay, so go ahead to the next slide. This makes the point here. You know, we can look at the pie, and again, in this pie, Canada is only producing roughly 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And there are some big players, China, the United States, India, Russia, etc. But once you get down to about 10, you know, we're not going to touch more than 50% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions if countries like Canada and those producing less than Canada don't also act. So it is imperative, this whole idea that, you know, we can't do anything unless China or the United States acts is patently false. We have a large responsibility. So you can go to the next slide. A more fair So even if we think about absolute measurements, Canada is very responsible, but actually a more fair comparison globally would be to look per capita. We have a small number of people living in this country, and if we look at greenhouse gas emissions per capita, we can see here that Canada's greenhouse emissions per capita is like more than 5 times the world average of greenhouse gas emissions per capita. I threw Saskatchewan in there too, just to show you that even within Canada, Saskatchewan holds an even larger responsibility in terms of our per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And so on the right-hand side of your slide there, you'll see that since the signing of the Copenhagen Accord, in 2005, when we were supposed to reduce our emissions, Canada's emissions are relatively flat. They've come down just slightly, but basically all of the good work that's been done in other provinces of the country to lower emissions has been offset by rapid increase of emissions coming from the oil and gas industries from 2 provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan. You can move ahead. So this is newer data from the, our data is always 2 years out of date because the national inventory reports are always 2 years back. So this is the most recent graph from the federal government. Where do Canada's emissions come from? And again, we can see over time that, can you put it back to the slide view? We can see over time that the oil and gas industry, again, it's contributing more and more to emissions over time. We also have to think about the transport sector. We have, of course, transportation. But just to make the point, between 1990 and 2020, the increase in total greenhouse gas emissions that was observed in Canada was mostly due to a 74% increase in emissions from the oil and gas sector and a 32% increase in emissions from the transportation sector. And in 2020, the oil and gas sector was the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for 27% of total national emissions. And I will turn that over to Simon. That was sort of the international context and Canada's role within it.
Thanks very much, Emily. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Apologies, we do have to get through a bunch of slides. So yeah, I hope we don't overwhelm you with information. But I wanted to turn to Saskatchewan, sort of get a sense of where we are in regards to, in regards to where we are in regards to total GHG emissions. So within Canada, Saskatchewan is the 4th largest emitter after Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. But as Emily sort of emphasized, it's really in regards to per capita emissions that you see the extent to which we are a high emission emitter. So this is per capita GHG emissions by province. As you can see, we are the highest, even higher than Alberta, the worst in the country. And just to sort of emphasize this point, you know, this is Saskatchewan compared to other oil producing jurisdictions, Qatar, Texas, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Granted, they have more people, but nevertheless, you know, on a per capita emission basis, we produce far more emissions than these other oil producing areas. So if we don't take responsibility for our own emissions, someone else will need to. So we have a profound responsibility to ourselves and to the rest of the world to make a concerted effort to reduce our emissions. So here's where Saskatchewan stands in regards to GHG emissions right now. We produced roughly 66 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. Now the dip looks like progress, and in any other circumstance, we might think it would be progress. Unfortunately, we need to keep in mind that the COVID pandemic is probably more responsible for the emission drop than any policy pursued by government. As you can see, it dips right into 2020, and those are the last that's the last year that we have data for in regards to carbon emissions. So we won't really be able to see for sure whether that's entirely due to the COVID pandemic or not until we get more updated data for 2021 and 2022. So what is the source of our emissions? Well, as you can see, agriculture, electricity, they all contribute a fair amount to our overall emissions, but it really is, as Emily sort of emphasized, the oil and gas sector that drives our high emission profile. Except for 2020, oil and gas has been responsible for over a third of Saskatchewan's emissions. And as production returns to more normal levels, I think we'll likely see oil and gas's contribution to emissions rise again. So what is the current government's plan to reduce our emissions? Well, these are targets taken from the government's Prairie Resilience Plan with the targeted reductions for each sector. You can see that almost half of their intended reductions are for carbon credits for existing practices that sequester carbon. In my opinion, this seems highly unlikely to be granted, particularly as it's an open question now whether we can even consider our forests as a carbon sink anymore, given that they may actually emit more carbon than they absorb due to the increased prevalence of wildfires and disease and infestation. In our opinion, this is an attempt by the government to shirk their full responsibility for adequate reductions by putting forward this sort of fantasy that they're going to gain all these credits for existing practices. So the actual emission reductions in the government's plan without credits is only about 14 and a half megatons, which is a long way off from the Paris target that Emily was talking about, and nowhere near the revised IPCC targets. The government's current plan is completely inadequate. We need to adopt a much more aggressive reduction measures to get us to where we need to be. But as we saw, the problem is we can't really get there without confronting the emissions of the oil and gas industry. So just to give clarity, here are the different targets of both the Saskatchewan government, the Paris Accords, and where the latest IPCC report says we need to get to. So the first in blue is where the Saskatchewan government current plan is supposed to get us without credits, about 63 megatons. And certainly, once again, we need to be cognizant that that 66 megaton figure was taken during the height of the pandemic. So whether or not it will remain there is an open question, but I'm highly dubious that it will continue to stay at 66 megatons. The green figure is the Paris Accords. If every province was to reduce their greenhouse emissions by a third, you would expect us to get to about 48 megatons. And finally, the revised IPCC revisions, which said that we need to be much more aggressive and try and achieve a 45% reduction rather than 30%. And that would mean that Saskatchewan would need to get to about 38 megatons by 2030. So almost a 50% reduction. And it's to be clear, it's not like the job is done once you reach these targets, right? The federal government has targeted an almost 80% reduction by 2050. So let me turn it back over to Emily, and she will tell you about the emissions profile of all of Saskatchewan's industrial sectors.
I'll try to do it quickly. I think I took too much time on the first part. Okay, so if we look at Saskatchewan's emissions by sector, here we have the electrical sector. So this is electricity generation. You can see here it's a substantial part of our overall emissions, and we will need to make substantial reductions in this sector. We still have coal-fired plants, but there are federal regulations. But it has been relatively level over the past 25 years. And again, at least in regard to electrical emissions, we do have a plan. Inadequate as though it might be, this is a point that we'll return to, although the federal government also has a plan for 2035. So you can move ahead. This is who consumes electricity in our in Saskatchewan. And you can notice here that we've underlined residential consumption. Only about 16.5% of total consumption goes to individual homes. So by far the largest consumers are the big power accounts. And these accounts are accounts like accounts like potash mines or uranium mines. So in fact, actually just 35 customers in Saskatchewan account for 45% of the power consumption in our province. And electricity consumption for the oil field is almost equivalent to residential consumption. So the point I want to emphasize here is that individual solutions like home upgrades or energy efficient appliances are not going to be sufficient by themselves to significantly reduce power consumption in our province. That doesn't mean that they aren't important. You should all do what you can in your homes, but if we focus solely on individuals without tackling large industrial consumers, we're not going to get very far in reducing our emissions from electricity consumption. So you can move ahead. Just to emphasize this point here is emissions from residential homes, about 2 megatons. This has been a similar sort of level for some time. And again, certainly a good idea to do your own part, but we can't get where we need to from residential emissions. You can move ahead. Agriculture is also a very large emitter in our province. It needs to be addressed. We're not going to address it tonight. It has increased from 1990 when it was about 10 megatons to 16 megatons today. There are good potential solutions to agricultural emissions that have been put forward by groups like the National Farmers Union. And I really encourage you to check out their reports because they have some interesting things planned. But it is a sector that does need to be tackled, but we're not going to talk about it too much tonight. We'll move ahead to transportation, which has gone from less than 6 megatons in 1990 to almost 10 megatons today. So transportation is a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. About half of those emissions are from domestic transportation, and the rest are from freight, so commercial trucking. So once again, if we focus only on, buying EV personal vehicles without addressing commercial trucking and transportation, we won't find the kinds of emissions reductions that we need. And we need to be mindful that this data is during the height of the pandemic again. So the reduction that we see here, the little slip at the end of the curve there, may not be permanent. So we'll go on finally to the oil and gas sector, point we've been making all night. It is one of the most responsible sectors for our high emissions. It's responsible for almost a third of all greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan. And so no effective climate strategy on the part of the government can ignore these emissions. And we simply can't get to where we need to go without drastically reducing emissions in this sector. The federal government will be introducing a cap for the oil and gas sector. They've announced it. We don't know what it's going to be. They seem to have been persuaded a lot. There's been a lot of lobbying of the federal government by the oil and gas sector. And they've sort of, gestured towards the idea that they can only mandate this cap on emissions. They can't actually mandate a phase out of fossil fuels because natural resources are a provincial jurisdiction. So we'd like to believe that the drop in oil and gas emissions that you see in this curve at the end is primarily due to policies that have been adopted by the government of Saskatchewan. And while there has been some progress on venting and flaring of methane, we also have to acknowledge that the reduction in emissions were driven by the drop in demand for oil during the COVID pandemic. So we don't have a lot of reason to believe that these numbers won't return to their historic norms if we don't address the root of the problem. So you can move along. This is the production of oil in the province, and you can see that it drops and that the reduction in emissions is probably associated with this drop in production around 2010. I thought I turned that off. Sorry. So basically, just to conclude this little section, what we should take away from this overview is that there's no viable strategy to reduce emissions in Saskatchewan without addressing the oil and gas sector. Individual strategies to get people to switch to hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles, to upgrade their homes, to do energy efficiency retrofits, they can all be part of an overall strategy to reduce emissions, and they certainly have importance, and it's good to encourage individuals to start doing these things and to get involved. But even if every individual resident in Saskatchewan reduced their emissions to zero, from their cars, their homes, their electricity consumption, it would only amount to a total reduction of between 10 and 20 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we need to have, a plan for these other sectors that move beyond just individuals. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you, Emily. So, what are our options? Well, as far as renewable energy and electricity production, we are actually very well positioned as a province. Oh, sorry. As fate would have it, Saskatchewan is not just abundant in non-renewable resources like oil, potash, and uranium. It's also abundant in renewable resources that have just barely begun to be tapped. So I just want to sort of take a look at the potential for renewable energy in Saskatchewan. So here's the country's solar potential. The red and orange areas hold the best potential for solar energy in the country. And as you can see, the greatest potential is in southern Saskatchewan. Also, the location of all of our major coal-fired generation plants. So this holds tremendous potential to incubate a new solar industry in part of the province that is fearful of the end of the coal industry. So it's ironic that the home for a dying industry would also be the home for a new and upcoming industry. But as luck would have it, we really could allay a lot of the fears of the future for coal communities in southern Saskatchewan by making large investments in solar in the same area. And just by way of comparison, Germany, which doesn't have close to the same solar profile as we do, generate over 10% of its electricity solely through solar, while we generate less than 1%. So we are just failing to tap this resource to the extent that we could. These are onshore wind speed potential in Canada. Once again, Saskatchewan holds immense promise, with much of southern Saskatchewan a viable site for wind energy. Again, ironic that our best area for renewable energy is the same area as coal production, but you would think a forward-thinking government could really mitigate the fears of job loss and investment in these coal mining communities by making substantial investments in solar and wind in these areas. Next is biomass. As you can see, Saskatchewan has some of the highest potential in the country in its northern forests, not to mention that as a major agricultural producer, we also have a generous supply of agricultural waste that could be repurposed for biogas generation. Lastly, we want to take a look at geothermal. Now, Saskatchewan's not as rich in geothermal potential as other parts of the country, but as you can see, certain geothermal processes are viable in the southern part of the province. So once again, another option that we just really aren't pursuing. Lastly, another untapped resource that rarely gets mentioned is energy efficiency. And we think we really need to think of energy efficiency as a resource. Every megawatt of energy that you don't use is a megawatt that doesn't need to be generated and is an emission that isn't generated, that's not produced. And we are woefully behind in comparison to the rest of the country. So this slide here is Energy Efficiency Canada's scorecard for the whole country. We rank dead last in energy efficiency, and we have done for the last 4 years pretty much. The scorecard really takes us to task over the fact that we have a virtually non-existent program to promote the electrification of transportation in the province. We have no incentives for personal electric vehicles or for fleet electrification, and no support for electrical charging infrastructure. We really do need an independent energy efficiency agency that can drive efficiency upgrades in the province. Efficiency Nova Scotia, which is an independent utility funded through electricity rates, is the major reason why that province is now considered a national leader in cutting energy waste. The creation of our own energy efficiency utility could see us make the same strides as Nova Scotia, which has seen over 12,000 energy efficient upgrades to homes and buildings that have delivered almost $180 million in annual energy savings and have avoided over a million tons in carbon emissions per year. So while we do have all these untapped resources, the current government is pursuing an altogether different strategy. Namely, they're relying on small modular nuclear reactors as a primary means to decarbonize electricity production in the province. The BWTX or whatever it's called, that's the modular reactor model that the province recently selected. Now, we just want to discuss this for a little bit because I think it's really important for people to understand. Almost every serious analyst agrees that renewables can probably economically deliver about 80% of grid energy, but there's still a debate about the remaining 20%. And certainly there are concerns with baseload, particularly as we don't in this province have massive hydro resources to draw upon. But as luck would have it, we live right next door to a huge hydro battery in Manitoba. We really should be maximizing those hydro deliveries from Manitoba, recognizing that a modern grid that's trying to become zero carbon needs to be viewed regionally, right? We need to stop thinking of our grid as, stopping at the Manitoba and Alberta border. There are also other potential solutions to baseload, such as forced hydro and battery technology that we simply haven't entertained or explored. Now, had the government thoroughly explored these options, as well as maximizing renewables, and then came to the conclusion that, we need nuclear energy to make up the difference, I think that would have been a good faith approach. But as with carbon capture technology, this government always seems to immediately pursue the most expensive, least effective technology that also has the curious feature of helping the fossil fuel industry. And as you can see in the bottom graphic, the small modular reactor industry is already marketing themselves to the oil industry as a way for them to decarbonize their upstream emissions. And you really have to wonder if the pursuit of SMRs by this current government isn't another way for them to provide a huge public subsidy to the oil industry. Beyond that, the bigger problem is that these technologies simply do not exist. None of them have been approved. None of them have been produced. The idea that they will be cheaper than conventional nuclear reactors, which are already astronomically expensive, is based entirely on the spurious notion that they will be able to achieve economies of scale because so many will be produced that they will be able to standardize production and churn them off an assembly line like an automobile. But the field of SMRs is littered with over 18 different types of technologies. The world hasn't chosen a single technology to adopt. Each country engaged in SMR research is using its own technology, using their own companies to support. So how many reactors are Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick going to purchase? Will it be 3? Will it be 6? Will it be 12? Will it be 20? Will it be enough to achieve the hundreds required to achieve economies of scale? I don't believe that's likely, and most analysts don't either. Moreover, a new Stanford University study estimates that SMRs may produce up to 30 times more nuclear waste than a conventional reactor, further compounding the problem of where will we store radioactive waste in this province. So why are we doing this? Why are we pursuing this non-existent, highly speculative technology that's also highly expensive and potentially highly dangerous? Well, in our opinion, it's because it allows the government to defer climate action while giving the appearance of climate action. They can pander to their base by asserting that while renewables aren't really fit for purpose, while also not really doing anything about the real problem because SMRs simply don't exist in a modern, deployable, operable form yet. It allows them to push off real progress on emissions reductions by pointing to some future technology that will do all the hard work for us. So in virtually every area of renewable energy, Saskatchewan is the best positioned place in the country to exploit these resources, yet we are not. As a province, we cannot claim poverty when it comes to renewable energy resources. We have a wealth of potential. We just do not have the vision to properly exploit them. So while transition to a post-carbon energy system will be challenging, no place in the country is really better suited for that transition. The question I think that leaves us with is, why are we not taking advantage of this prime position? What's preventing us? Why are we leaving all these renewable sources of energy untapped and instead forging ahead with what many consider to be a very expensive and very untested foray into small modular nuclear reactors? Well, we often talk about the lack of political will, and certainly that's part of it. But we also have to recognize that that lack of political will is often the result of tremendous concentrations of economic and political power that would rather continue with business as usual. Interests who view any transformation of the status quo as a fundamental threat. And so just to conclude our presentation tonight, Emily will speak to who we think is the primary contributor to the obstruction and the continuation of the status quo.
Emily, you're muted.
Shoot, sorry, that had to happen once. In order to affect a meaningful transition, we believe that we need to really confront the power of the oil and gas industries and the nuclear industries in order to sort of loosen up the influence over government's climate policy. So it's no secret that the oil and gas industry is the largest contributor to Saskatchewan party coffers and one of the most active lobbyists in regards to energy and environmental policy. They're the primary reason we have perhaps the most unregulated energy sector in North America, which has been characterized as the Wild West by me and other scholars. And if we're honest, they are the reason why we're lagging so far behind in regards to tapping our renewable energy potential. So this government has made it no secret that they'll fight every challenge to the dominance of the oil and gas industry tooth and nail. And we've made criticism of the industry they've made criticism of the industry tantamount to treason in our province. And the degree to which the provincial NDP has bought into that narrative has made it particularly ineffective on the climate issue. So to conclude, we've given here the contributions to the Saskatchewan Party, and certainly when the NDP was in power, it had more contributions as well from the oil and gas industry. But looking forward, it's vitally important that we recognize, again, this power of the oil and gas industry to obstruct positive momentum on climate policy in our province. And we already have one major political party that's captured by the interests of the industry. And we believe we can't afford to have two. So in our view, there's a vital role for the grassroots of the NDP to change the stance of the party. So here's finally, last slide, some things that we think could advance progress on the climate crisis in our province. I always get asked at the end of presentations, like, but what can I do? And so I always like to leave on a message in that regard. And I think like the very most important thing that we can do is to hammer home the message that it's not what we can do in our individual lives that matters, right? There's actually no room for fossil fuels in a zero emissions future. And we need to start advocating wherever possible for a managed decline of the fossil fuel industries through a just transition. And that's certainly some research that we've done around like equity and justice in this process that we don't have time to get into tonight unless you want to ask some questions about it. But part of this strategy is that we really need to confront the power and disempower the fossil fuel industries wherever possible. And so one thing that we wanted to leave you with tonight is to think a little bit about, how do the fossil fuel industries influence or wield their influence within the New Democratic Party? And how might you as members purge fossil fuel interests from the party itself? Some things that we have seen in addition to like some of the changes you can make in your individual lives include, the growing sort of importance of the divestment campaigns. And if you are part of like universities or the Canada Pension Plan or other financial interests, you can make the case wherever you might go that, investing in these sources, investing in fossil fuels is a dead end and that we have to divest. We can meet with politicians. I have NDP friends who are in caucus who say nobody ever calls a meeting with them and asks to meet with them about climate change. It's important to make sure that, your MLA, whether they are NDP or not, hears from you that this is an important issue. We need a campaign to pressure SaskPower. SaskPower is driving ahead with this SMR future, which allows them to do nothing in the present. How can we mount a campaign together around pressuring SaskPower to do the right thing? One area that we see that there is momentum, and that's why I think some of the movements in Saskatoon and Regina especially have been focused at the municipal level, is that there are transition plans and there are politicians at the municipal level who are committed to advancing transition plans. So it's limited in so many ways, but get involved where there is momentum. Help out your local councillors in terms of pushing forward municipal transition, because if we can do it in Regina and Saskatoon and a few other cities within the province, then we've got the majority. And as consumers, right, it is important, you can do the individual things in your household, but I want to leave this idea with you that collective consumption is always better than private consumption. So where possible, right, advocate for things like public transportation, take public transportation, think about ways to consume what you are consuming collectively rather than privately. So I think we're past our 40 minutes.